The Nights in Lisbon by Erich Remarque. Chapter 1. I stared at the ship. Glaringly lighted, it lay at anchor in the Tagus. Though I had been in Lisbon for a week, I hadn't yet got used to its carefree illumination. In the countries I had come from, the cities at night were black as coal mines, and a lantern in the darkness was more to be feared than the plague in the Middle Ages. I had come from 20th century Europe. The ship was a passenger vessel. It was being loaded. I knew it was going to sail the next afternoon. In the harsh glow of the naked light bulbs, crates of meat, fish, canned goods, bread, and vegetables were being lowered into the hold. Stevedores were carrying baggage on board, lifting up crates and bales as silently as if they had been weightless. The ship was being made ready for a voyage, like the Ark in the days of the flood. It was an Ark. Every ship that left Europe in those months of the year 1942 was an Ark. Mount Ararat was America, and the floodwaters were rising higher by the day. Long ago they had engulfed Germany and Austria. Now they stood deep in Poland and Prague. Amsterdam, Brussels, Copenhagen, Oslo, and Paris had gone under. The cities of Italy stank of seepage, and Spain too were no longer safe. The coast of Portugal had become the last hope of the fugitives to whom justice, freedom, and tolerance meant more than home and livelihood. This was the gate to America. If you couldn't reach it, you were lost, condemned to bleed away in a jungle of consulates, police stations, and government offices, where visas were refused and work and residence permits unobtainable, a jungle of internment camps, bureaucratic red tape, loneliness, homesickness, and withering universal indifference. As usual in times of war, fear and affliction, the individual human being had ceased to exist. Only one thing counted: a valid passport. That afternoon I had gone to the Casino Estoril to gamble. I still owned a good suit, and they had let me in. It was a last desperate effort to blackmail fate. Our Portuguese residence permit would expire in a few days, and Ruth and I had no other visas. We had made our plans in France and drawn up a list of possible sailings for New York. The ship anchored in the Tagus had been the last on our list, but it was sold out for months. We had no American visas, and we were more than $300 short of the fare. I had tried to raise the money at least, in the only way still possible for a foreigner in Lisbon: by gambling. An absurd idea, for even if I had won, it would have taken a miracle to get us aboard. But in danger and despair you acquire a faith in miracles. Without it, you would go under. I lost $56 of the $62 we still had left. It was late at night, and the quayside was almost deserted. But after a while I became aware of a man not far off. First he paced aimlessly about. Then he stopped, and he, too, began to stare at the ship. Another stranded refugee, I thought, and took no further notice of him, until I felt that he was watching me. A refugee never loses his fear of the police, not even when he is asleep or when there is nothing to be afraid of. So I turned away with an affectation of bored indifference and started to leave the pier, slowly, like a man who has no ground for fear. A moment later I heard steps behind me. I kept on walking, but without hastening my step, wondering how I could let Ruth know if I was arrested. The pastel-tinted houses at the end of the pier, asleep like butterflies in the night, were still too far away to make a run for it and disappear in the tangle of narrow streets. Now the man was beside me. He was a little shorter than I. "Are you a German?" he asked in German. I shook my head and kept on walking. Austrian? I did not answer. I looked at the pastel-tinted houses, which were approaching much too slowly. I knew they were Portuguese policemen who spoke German very well. I'm not a policeman, the man said. I didn't believe him. He was wearing civilian clothes, but plainclothes men had arrested me half a dozen times in Europe. I had papers, not a bad job, done in Paris by a mathematics teacher from Prague, but they wouldn't have stood close scrutiny. I saw you looking at the ship, the man said. That made me wonder. I mustered him with indifference. He didn't really look like a policeman, but the last plainclothesman who had nabbed me in Bordeaux had looked as pathetic as Lazarus after 3 days in his grave, and he had been the most heartless of the lot. He had pulled me in, even though he knew the Germans would be in Bordeaux next day, and it would have been all up with me if a kindly warden hadn't let me out a few hours later. Do you want to go to New York? The man asked. I did not reply. 20 yards more would do it. Then, if necessary, I could knock him down and run for it. Here, said the man, reaching into his pocket, are 2 tickets for that boat. I saw the tickets. I couldn't read the writing in the feeble light, but we had covered enough ground. It was safe to stop now. What is all this? I asked him in Portuguese. I had learned a few words of the language. You can have them, said the man. I don't need them. You don't need them? What do you mean? I don't need them anymore. I stared at the man. I couldn't understand. He really didn't seem like a policeman. If he had wanted to arrest me, he could have done so without these fancy tricks. But if the tickets were good, why couldn't he use them? And why did he offer them to me? Something began to tremble inside me. I can't buy them, I said finally in German. They're worth a fortune. There are wealthy refugees in Lisbon. They'll pay anything you ask. You come to the wrong man. I haven't any money. I don't want to sell them, said the man. I looked back at the tickets. Are they real? He handed them to me without a word. They crackled between my fingers. They were genuine. Possession of them was the difference between ruin and salvation. Even if I couldn't use them without American visas, I could still try next morning to get visas on the strength of them, or at least I could sell them. That would mean 6 months more survival. I don't understand, I said. You can have them, he replied. For nothing. I'm leaving Lisbon tomorrow morning. There was only one condition. My arm sagged. I knew it was too good to be true. What is it? I asked. I don't want to be alone tonight. You want me to stay with you? Yes, until morning. That's all? That's all. Nothing else? Nothing else. I looked at him incredulously. I knew, of course, that people in our situation could go to pieces, that solitude was sometimes unbearable. I knew this dread of the void that attacks people whose world has become a void, and I knew that the company, even of a total stranger, could save a man from suicide. But in such cases people helped each other as a matter of course. There was no need to offer a reward, and not such a reward. Where do you live? I asked. He made a negative gesture. I don't want to go there. Isn't there a bar that's still open? There must be. Isn't there a place that caters to refugees, like the Café de la Rosa in Paris? I knew the Café de la Rosa. Ruth and I slept there for 2 weeks. The patron would let you stay as long as you please for the price of a cup of coffee. You spread out some newspapers and lay down on the floor. I never slept on tables. You can't fall off the floor. I don't know of any, I replied. This was not true. But you don't take a man with 2 boat tickets to give away to a place frequented by people who would have sold their souls to get a hold of them. I only know one place, said the man. We can try it. Maybe it's still open. He motioned to a solitary cab and looked at me. All right, I said. We got in, and he gave the driver an address. I'd have liked to let Ruth know that I wouldn't be home that night. But as I entered the dark, foul-smelling cab, I was assailed by so furious, so terrible a hope that my head almost reeled. Maybe all this really was true. Maybe our lives were not at an end, and the impossible was happening. Maybe we were going to be saved. Once this thought has entered my mind, I was afraid to leave the stranger out of sight for so much as a second. We circled round the theatrical-looking Praca de Comercio, and after a time came to a tangle of sloping alleys and stairways. I did not know this part of Lisbon. As usual, I was chiefly acquainted with the churches and the museums. Not that I was so much in love with God or art, but simply because in churches and museums no one asks for your papers. In the presence of Christ crucified in the great masters, you are still a human being, not an individual with dubious papers. We left the cab and continued up the stairways and crooked streets. There was a smell of fish, garlic, night flowers, dead sunshine, and sleep. Under the rising moon, the St. George Castle rose up out of the night to one side, and the moonlight cascaded down the stairways. I turned around and looked down at the harbor. Down there lay the river, and the river was freedom and life. It flowed into the ocean, and the ocean was America. I stopped still. I hope you aren't playing tricks on me, I said. No, said the man. With the tickets, I mean. He had put them back into his pocket on the pier. No, said the man. I'm not playing tricks. He pointed to a little square framed in trees. That's the place I mean. It's still open. We won't attract attention. Almost all the customers are foreigners. They'll think we're leaving tomorrow and that we're celebrating our last night in Portugal before taking the boat. The place was a kind of late restaurant with a small dance floor and a terrace, made to order for the tourist trade. Someone was playing a guitar, and in the background a girl was singing a fado. On the terrace, several of the tables were occupied by foreigners. There was a woman in evening dress and a man in a white dinner jacket. We found a table at the end of the terrace. You could look down at Lisbon, at the churches in the pale light, the streets, the harbor, the piers, and the ship that was an ark. Do you believe in survival after death? Asked the man with the tickets. I looked up. I had expected anything but that. I don't know, I said finally. In the last few years, I've been too busy worrying about survival before death. I'll think about it when I'm in America. I added, to remind him of the steamer tickets he had promised me. I don't, he said. I sighed with relief. I was prepared to listen to anything, but I couldn't have stood a discussion. I was too restless. Down there lay the ship. The man sat there for a time as though sleeping with his eyes open. Then, when the guitar player came out on the terrace, he woke up. My name is Schwartz, he said. That's not my real name. It's the name on my passport. But I've got used to it. It will do for tonight. Were you in France long? As long as they let me stay. Interned. When the war broke out, like everyone else. The man nodded. So were we. I was happy, he said quickly and softly, with bowed head and eyes averted. I was very happy, happier than I ever thought I could be. I turned around in surprise. He really didn't look like a man who would talk like that. He seemed rather nondescript and retiring. When? I asked. In the camp? No. Before. In 1939? In France? Yes. The summer before the war. I still don't understand how it all came about. That's why I have to talk to somebody now. I don't know anyone here, but if I have to tell somebody about it, it will come back to me. It will become clear in my mind, and it will stay. I simply have to. He broke off. Do you understand? He asked after a while. Yes, I said. It's not hard to understand, Mr. Schwartz. It's impossible to understand, he replied with sudden violence. She's lying down there in a room with closed windows, in a hideous wooden coffin. She's dead. She don't exist anymore. Who can understand that? No one. Not you, and not I. No one. And anyone who says he understands is a liar. I said nothing and waited. I had often sat with a man in a similar situation. Losses were harder to bear when you had no country of your own. There was nothing to sustain you, and the strange country became so terribly strange. I had been through it myself in Switzerland when I received the news that my parents had been killed and cremated in a concentration camp. The thought of my mother's eyes in the fire of the crematorium had haunted me. I assume, said Schwartz more calmly, that you know what refugee jitters are. I nodded. A waiter brought us a bowl full of shrimp. I suddenly realized I was very hungry and remembered that I hadn't eaten since lunchtime. I looked hesitantly across at Schwartz. Go ahead and eat, he said. I'll wait. He ordered wine and cigarettes. I ate quickly. The shrimp were fresh and well seasoned. Forgive me, I said, but I'm very hungry. I watched Schwartz while I ate. He sat there calmly, looking down at the great stage sets called Lisbon, and showed no sign of impatience or irritation. It gave me a kind of affection for him. He seemed to realize that whatever the book of etiquette might say on the subject, a man could be hungry even in the presence of unhappiness without being unfeeling. If there's nothing you can do to help, you might as well eat your food before it's taken away from you, because that can happen any time. I pushed the dish aside and took a cigarette. It was a long time since I had smoked. I had gone without in order to have a little more to gamble with. The jitters got into me in the spring of '39, said Schwartz. I've been a refugee for more than 5 years. Where were you in the fall of '38? In Paris. So was I. I had given up. It was just before the Munich Pact. My fear had exhausted itself. I still hid and took precautions out of habit, but I had given up. There would be war and the Germans would come and get me. That was my fate. I was resigned to it. I nodded. That was the time of the suicide wave. It was a curious thing. When the Germans really came a year and a half later, there were fewer suicides. Then came the Munich Pact, said Schwartz. That fall we won a new lease on life. Life was so sweet, so light, that we got careless. The chestnut trees actually blossomed a second time that year in Paris. Do you remember? It went to my head. I began to feel human again, and, what was worse, to act human. So the police caught me and locked me up for 4 weeks for repeated unauthorized entry. It was the old game all over again. They pushed me across the border at Basel. The Swiss sent me back. The French sent me across at another place. I was locked up again. You know the routine. This game of chess with human. I know. It was no joke in the wintertime. The Swiss prisons were the best. Heated like hotels. I began to eat again. There's something good about unpleasant memories. They make you think you're happy when a moment before you were convinced of contrary. Happiness is a question of degree. When you know that, you're seldom completely unhappy. I had been happy in Swiss prisons because they were not German prisons. But here in front of me sat a man who spoke as if he had the least unhappiness, although somewhere in Lisbon a wooden coffin was standing in an airless room. The last time they released me, they said they had to send me back to Germany if they caught me again without papers, said Schwartz. It was only a threat, but it scared me. I began to wonder what I'd do if it really happened. I began to dream at nights that I was in Germany with the SS on my tracks. I had that dream so often that I began to be afraid of falling asleep. Has that ever happened to you? I could write a thesis about it, I replied. One night I dreamed I was in Osnabrück, the city where I had lived and where my wife was still living. I stood in her room and saw that she was sick. She was thin as a reed, and she was in tears. I woke up in a cold sweat. I hadn't seen her or heard from her in 5 years. I hadn't written either because I didn't know whether her mail was being opened. Before I left, she had promised to get a divorce. I thought that would make it easier for her. And for a few years I thought she had done so. Schwartz was silent for a time. I didn't ask him why he had left Germany. There were plenty of reasons, none of them interesting, but all were unjust. It's not interesting to be a victim. Either he was a Jew, or he had belonged to a political party hostile to the regime, or he had enemies who had risen to positions of influence. In Germany, there were dozens of reasons for being thrown into a concentration camp or executed. I managed to get back to Paris, says Schwartz, but that dream left me no peace. It kept coming back. At the same time, the illusion in the Munich Pact was shattered. By spring, everyone knew there was going to be war. You could smell it, as you smell a fire long before you see it. Only the diplomats shut their eyes and dreamed wishful dreams of a second or third Munich, or anything but war. Never have so many people believed in miracles as in our times, when there aren't any. Oh yes, there are, I said, or we wouldn't any of us be alive today. Schwartz nodded. That's true. Private miracles. I had one myself. I began in Paris. I suddenly inherited a valid passport. That's the one in the name of Schwartz. It belonged to an Austrian I had met at the Café de la Rosa. He died, leaving me his passport and his money. He had arrived only 3 months before. I had met him in the Louvre, looking at the Impressionists. I often went there in the afternoons to quiet my nerves. When you looked at those peaceful, sun-drenched landscapes, you just couldn't believe that a species capable of creating such paintings was going to unleash a murderous war. A soothing illusion that sent your blood pressure down for an hour or two. The man with the passport in the name of Schwartz often stood looking at Monet's Nénuphars and cathedrals. We started to talk, and he told me that after the Anschluss he has managed to get out of Austria by giving up his fortune, consisting of a collection of Impressionists. It had been seized by the state. He had no regrets. As long as paintings were shown in museums, he could regard them as his own, without having to worry about fire and theft. Besides, there were better pictures in the French museums than he had ever owned. Instead of being wedded to his own mediocre collection as a father is wedded to his family, under obligation to prefer his own, he now possessed all the pictures in the public museums without effort or responsibility. He was a strange man, quiet, gentle, cheerful in spite of all he had been through. He had been able to take very little money with him. He had saved a number of old stamps. Stamps are the smallest things to hide, easier than diamonds. It's hard to walk on diamonds if you've hidden them in your shoes and you are called out of the train for questioning. You can't sell them except at a great loss, and a good many questions are always asked. Stamps are for collectors. Collectors aren't so curious. How did he get them out? I asked, with a professional interest common to all refugees. He took some old, harmless-looking letters with him and hid the stamps under the lining of the envelopes. The customs officer checked the letters, but not the envelopes. Not bad, I said. He also took 2 little English portraits, pencil drawings. He put them in hideous gilt frames and said they were portraits of his parents. He slipped 2 Degas drawings in between the portraits in the backing. Not bad, I said again. In April he had a heart attack. He gave me his passport, what stamps he had left, and the drawings. He also gave me the addresses of some people who would buy the stamps. When I dropped in to see him next morning, he lay dead in his bed, so changed by the silence that I could hardly recognize him. I took what money he had left and a suit and some underwear. He had told me to do so the day before. He preferred leaving his belongings to the companion in fate than to the landlord. Did you alter the passport? I asked. Only the photo and the year of birth. Schwartz was 20 years older than I. Our first names were the same. Who did it? Brunet? Somebody from Munich. That was Brunet, the passport doctor. He is an artist. Brunet was well known for his skillful doctoring of identification papers. He had helped no end of people, but he himself had no papers when he was arrested. He was superstitious. He believed himself to be an honorable man and a public benefactor, and was convinced that nothing would happen to him as long as he did not practice his art for his own benefit. He had been the owner of a small print shop in Munich. Where is he now? I asked. Isn't he in Lisbon? I didn't know, but it was possible, if he was still alive. Funny thing, says Schwartz. When I had the passports, I didn't dare to use it. Besides, it took me a few days to get used to my new name. I kept repeating it to myself. Crossing the Champs-Élysées, I mumbled my name and my new place and date of birth. I sat in the museum gazing at the Renoirs, and if I was alone, I rehearsed an imaginary dialogue. Stern voice, Schwartz, and I jumped to my feet and answered, Here, or snarl, Name, and reply automatically, Joseph Schwartz, born in Wiener Neustadt on June 22nd, 1898. I'd even practiced before I went to sleep. I didn't want to be awakened by a policeman and say the wrong name before I collect my wits. I had to forget my old name completely. There is a difference between having no passport and having a false one. The false one is more dangerous. I sold the 2 English drawings. I received less for them than I had expected, but now I had money, more money than I had seen in a long time. Then one night I had an idea that stayed with me from then on. Wouldn't it be possible for me to go to Germany with this passport? It was almost genuine, and why should anyone get suspicious at the border? I could see my wife again. I could appease my fears about her. I could... Schwartz looked at me. You must know that feeling. Refugee jitters in their purest form, that tightening in the stomach, in the throat, and in the back of the eyes. Everything you've been trying to bury for years, all the things you've done your best to forget, that you've avoided like the plague, come to life again. Memory is a deadly disease for a refugee. It's his cancer of the soul. I tried to down it. I kept going to see those paintings of peace and quietness. The Sicilies, and Pissarros, and Renoirs. I spent hours in the museum, but now it had the opposite effect on me. The pictures no longer pacified me. They began to cry out, to challenge, to remind me of a country that hadn't yet been ravaged by the brown leprosy, of evenings in streets bordered by walls overgrown with lilac, of the golden sunsets in the old city, of green belfries with swallows flying round them, and of my wife. I'm a plain man without any special qualities. For 4 years I had lived with my wife as most men do, peacefully, pleasantly, but without great passion. After the first few months, our relationship had become what is called a happy marriage, a relationship between 2 considerate people who don't expect too much. Our dreams belonged to the past, but we didn't miss them. We were reasonable people, and we were very fond of each other. Now I saw everything in a new light. I began to reproach myself. It was my fault that our marriage had been so commonplace. I had bungled everything. What had I lived for? What was I doing now? I had crawled into a hole. I was vegetating. How long would it go on? And how would it end? The war would come, and Germany was bound to win. No other country was fully prepared. And then what? Where could I crawl to, even assuming that I still had the time and strength? What camp would I starve in? Against what wall would I be shot, if I were lucky? The passport that should have been giving me peace drove me to despair. I wandered through the streets until I was dead tired, but I couldn't sleep, and when I did drop off, my dreams woke me up. I saw my wife in the cellars of the Gestapo. I heard her calling for help in the courtyard of my hotel. And one day, as I entered the Café de la Rosa, I thought I saw her face in the mirror across from the door. For a moment, she turned toward me. She was pale. Her eyes were desolate. And then she slipped away. I had seen her so clearly I was sure she was really there. I ran into the back room. As usual, it was full of people, but she was not among them. For a few days I was obsessed with the thought that she had come to Paris and was looking for me. Dozens of times I saw her turn the corner. I saw her sitting on a bench in the Luxembourg Gardens, and when I reached the spot, a strange face looked up at me in surprise. She crossed the Place de la Concorde, just as the stream of traffic was about to start up again. And this time it was really she. Her gait, the way she squared her shoulders, I even seemed to recognize her dress. But when the traffic policeman finally stopped the stream of cars and I was able to run after her, she had vanished, swallowed up by the black maw of the metro. I raced down the stairs and was just in time to see the mocking taillights of the train receding in the darkness. I confided in a friend. His name is Lucere. He sold stockings and had formerly been a doctor in Breslau. He advised me not to spend so much of my time alone. "Find yourself a woman," he said. It didn't help. You know these affairs born of misery, loneliness, fear. You hanker after human warmth, a voice, a body, and you wake up in a strange, awful room, feeling as though you're falling off the earth. In your desolation, you're grateful for the sound of breathing beside you, but then your imagination starts working again, and after a while nothing is left but an ugly feeling of having abused yourself. When I talk about it now, it all sounds absurd and contradictory. It was different to then. All my struggles added up to one thing. I had to go back. I had to see my wife again. Possibly she had been living with someone else for heaven knew how long. That didn't matter. I had to see her. To me, that seemed perfectly logical. Every day it became clear that the war was inevitable. Hitler had lost no time in breaking his promise to content himself with the Sudetenland and to spare the rest of Czechoslovakia. Obviously, he was going to do the same with Poland. That meant war, because France and England had both had alliances with Poland, and it was no longer a question of months, but of weeks or even the days. For me, too, I'd had to decide quickly. My whole life depended on it, and I did decide. I decided to go back. What would happen afterward I didn't know, and I didn't care. If war came, I was lost in any case. I might as well do this insane thing. A strange peace came over me in the last few days. It was May, and the flower beds in the rond-point were bright with tulips. The evenings were bathed in the silvery light and blue shadows of the Impressionists. Behind the cold glare of the first street lamps rose the high, pale green sky, and across the roofs of the newspaper buildings ran restless red ribbons of luminous writing, spelling out war for all who could read. First, I went to Switzerland. I had to try out my passport in a safe place before I could really trust it. The French border guard handed it back to me with indifference. That I had expected. Only countries under dictatorship are hard to get out of. But when the swift guard came in, I felt something shrinking inside me. I sat there as nonchalantly as I could, but at the edges of my lungs I felt a fluttering, as of a leaf that begins to go wild on a windless day. The guard looked at my passport. He was a powerful, broad-shouldered man who smelled of pipe smoke. As he stood in the doorway of the compartment, he blocked off the light, and for a moment I had the feeling that it was my freedom he was shutting out, that the compartment had become a prison cell. Then he handed me back the passport. "You've forgotten to stamp it," I said, so eased with relief that the words poured out much faster than I intended. The guard smiled. "Don't worry, I'll stamp it. Does it make so much difference?" "No, but to me it's a kind of souvenir." The man stamped the passport and left. I bit my lips. How nervous I had become. Then it occurred to me that the passport looked a little more authentic with the stamp. In Switzerland, I spent a day wondering whether I should take the train into Germany. In the end, I was afraid to. I didn't know whether the passports of Germans, or even of former Austrians returning home, might not be examined with special care. Probably not, but still it seemed advisable to cross the border unofficially. In Zurich, I went to the main post office, as I had on my first arrival years before. At the general deliveries window, you were almost sure to meet acquaintances, homeless souls without residence permits, who could give you information. From there, I went to the Café Grief, the Swiss version of the Café de la Rosa. I met a number of people who had sneaked across the border, but no one who really knew how to cross safely back into Germany. That was understandable, except for me, who would want to go to Germany. I noticed the way they looked at me. Then, when they saw I was serious, they shrank away from me. Anyone who was planning to return must be a traitor. But who would go back unless he accepted the regime? And if a man could do that, then what might he do next? Whom or what would he betray? I was alone. They'd avoided me as if I'd been a murderer, and I couldn't explain. When I thought about what I was going to do, I was so panic-stricken that I broke into a sweat. How could I possibly explain it to anyone else? At 6 o'clock, the third morning, the police came and pulled me out of bed. It was clear to me that one of my acquaintances had reported me. They looked at my passport suspiciously and took me along for questioning. It was lucky now that the passport had been stamped, because I was able to prove that I had entered the country legally and had only been there for 3 days. I shall never forget that early morning as I passed through the streets under guard. It was a clear day, and the towers and roofs of the city stood out sharply against the sky, as though cut out of metal. From a bakery came the smell of warm bread, and all the consolation in the world seemed to be in that smell. Do you know what I mean? I nodded. The world never looks more beautiful than when you're being locked up, when you're about to leave it. If only we could always keep this feeling. I had that feeling. Were you able to hold it? I asked. I don't know, Schwartz answered slowly. That's what I want to find out. It slipped through my fingers. But even when I held it, did I have it completely? Can't I possibly win it back again, stronger than before, and hold on to it forever? Now that I can't change any more. Don't we always lose what we think we have hold of? Do we lose it because it moves? And does it stand still only when it's gone and can no longer change? Is it only then that it really belongs to us? His eyes were fixed on me in a rigid stare. It was the first time he had looked me full in the face. His pupils were dilated. A fanatic or a madman, I thought. The woman in the evening dress at the next table stood up. She looked across the veranda down at the city and the harbor. "Darling, why do we have to go back?" she said to the man in the white dinner jacket. "If only we could stay here. I don't feel a bit like going back to America."